shape of Egypt's political borders that you see on maps isn't really the actual shape or reality of this country. In truth, Egypt's real shape looks much more like this. More than 102 million people call Egypt their home today, and an overwhelming 95% of all of them live either along the banks of the Nile River itself or within the Nile Delta region in the north. Just before the Nile fans out into this extremely fertile delta region can be found the city of Cairo. The deserts around the Nile provided a thick layer of geographic defenses against any hostile invader. From the Nile Delta, it is nearly 1,000 kilometers across the barren and rainless Sahara to the west, before you reach another area that actually receives enough rainfall to support another urban population. To the east of the Nile Delta is the Sinai Peninsula, which is almost as equally inhospitable and empty as the Sahara, and so similarly difficult for armies to cross, albeit shorter. To the north is the Mediterranean Sea, and then to the south, the Nile River Valley narrows and curves for more than 1,000 kilometers through the desert. Invading armies coming from the south would have to choose between marching through the hostile, empty desert or follow the rich route of the Nile. But since the Nile itself is very narrow, that route can be easily defended by fortifications built by any civilization based around the Nile in Egypt. An overwhelming 97% of all of modern Egypt's water supplies for her 102 million citizens to drink and farm comes exclusively from the Nile. And so any perceived threat to the river would naturally be interpreted by any regime in Cairo as an existential threat to the survival of the state. For thousands of years, no such threat ever emerged to disrupt the life-giving waters that the Nile provides to Egypt, until potentially a little more than a decade ago, in 2011. As universally important as the Nile River is to Egypt, the river and all the water that flows through it does not begin in Egypt. Before the river even reaches Egypt, it stretches and winds for thousands of kilometers through 10 other countries first. The Nile has no true single starting place, but is fed by two primary tributary rivers, the White Nile and the Blue Nile. The White Nile is fed by the waters of the African Great Lakes and roughly begins in Uganda, while the Blue Nile is fed by the vast waters originating in the high, rainy, and largely alpine climate-type Ethiopian highlands. Eventually, the Blue and White Nile tributaries converge at the city of Khartoum in modern-day Sudan, and then join together to form the full Nile River from there all the way through Egypt and the Delta into the Mediterranean. The Blue Nile contributes roughly 59% of all the water that makes its way through Egypt, while the White Nile contributes the remaining 41%. Thus, the majority of the water in the Nile that flows through Egypt and supports all of Egyptian civilization has always begun in the Ethiopian highlands more than 1,200 kilometers away from Egypt's southernmost contemporary border. The water running down the tributary contains a lot of violent rapids that possess a very high amount of kinetic energy. Perfect scenario to capture the water's kinetic energy to spin a turbine to generate electricity. As such, there have been proposals and discussions going back decades within Ethiopia to construct hydroelectric power dams across their sections of the Blue Nile. But these proposals have always been fiercely resisted by every single government that has ever found itself in power further to the north in Cairo. The fears in Egypt have always been that if Ethiopia were to construct any dams across their sections of the Blue Nile, they could interrupt or even decrease the flows of precious water through the Nile downriver to Egypt, and therefore threaten Egypt's survival as a state. Egypt signed a treaty with Britain known as the 1929 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty. The Suez Canal represented the quickest possible way for British vessels to reach India from the home island. Wishing to placate Egypt and retain their colonial control over the canal, Britain's 1929-era treaty with Egypt effectively granted Egypt and Sudan the rights to all of the water in the Nile River. It even gave Egypt the right to veto any construction project on the Nile or any of its tributaries further upriver in any of the 10 other Nile countries that may interfere with the flow of water downstream into Egypt. While the opinions of African countries like Ethiopia that were independent and free from colonialism at the time were simply ignored and not invited to participate in any of the negotiations. Until an event in 2011 finally provided the Ethiopians with their chance. The Arab Spring ripped a wave of revolution and instability across the entire Arab world. The man who had ruled Egypt as president for the past 30 years was not immune to the wave of revolution and was toppled from power in the country as millions of protesters took to the streets and the military turned against him in a junta. And as Egypt remained in the midst of chaotic revolution, the Ethiopian government seized on the opportunity the chaos in Cairo provided by announcing that they would begin construction on an unprecedentedly massive hydroelectric dam project across the Blue Nile. It would become known as the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. With a total of 13 turbines that will eventually generate more than 5,000 megawatts of electricity once fully operational, the dam would literally more than double the amount of electricity produced in Ethiopia when finished, and would therefore dramatically expand electricity access to the nearly half of the country's people who continue to remain in the darkness without any power. But that wouldn't even be the only tremendous benefit. So great would be the amount of electricity produced by the GERD that Ethiopia could even export the excess electricity produced there to neighboring countries in Africa as well, and earn further increased revenue. Tens of millions of Africans would gain access to electricity for the very first time, while the Ethiopian government would earn billions of dollars in increased revenue. All Ethiopians of all backgrounds could get behind supporting the country's completion of the dam, as it became increasingly viewed as the best possible way for Ethiopia to lift tens of millions of their citizens out of poverty and bring itself into the 21st century industrialized world. But just as the GERD increasingly became viewed as an existential necessity for Ethiopia, it also began being simultaneously viewed as an existential threat towards Egypt's very survival. This was because once the dam had been finished being built in 2020, the Ethiopians would inevitably have to begin holding back the water supplies of the Blue Nile in order to fill up the massive reservoir half the size of Rhode Island behind it. The question on everybody's minds in Egypt was how long would the Ethiopians take to fill it? If they took their time with it and spent a couple decades to fill the reservoir up, as Egypt initially began insisting they do, they would only hold back a relatively small amount of water in the Blue Nile every year, and thus continue allowing the vast majority of the Blue Nile's water year-round to continue flowing down to Egypt. But on the other hand, if Ethiopia decided to fill up the reservoir very rapidly in a matter of only something like 5 years, then they would be holding back a massive amount of the Blue Nile's waters for all 5 of those years in order to do so. Under a scenario like this, it is conceivable that Egypt could experience drastic cuts in their available water supply until the GERD's reservoir is fully filled up. A 2021 environmental research study found that Egypt would stand to lose approximately $28 billion in agricultural output if the Ethiopians insisted on filling up the GERD's reservoir in 5 years, and Egypt did nothing to mitigate its associated water deficits. More than half of Egypt's entire population of 102 million people have only been born since 1998, just 25 years ago, and only a bit over 4% of the population is of retirement age older than 65. And the simple problem is that there are just not enough jobs in Egypt for so many young people all to have. The ever-growing population has placed higher demands and strains on Egypt's limited water and food supplies, and millions of unemployed young people in a country with almost nothing to really lose presents a very dangerous reality. Desperate people without jobs or a future have enough time and willpower to carry out a revolution that can potentially reverse their fortunes. This is why Egypt began by demanding that Ethiopia take 12 to 21 years to fill up the GERD's reservoir, and has been currently demanding a timeline of 11 years. But delaying filling up the reservoir for a decade or more is a difficult pill for Ethiopia to swallow, because it means more time that they won't be using the dam to produce electricity, resulting in billions of dollars worth of lost revenue and productivity for them, and the continued inability for them to use the electricity to further accelerate their development progress. Beginning in 2020, Ethiopia appears to have settled on a 7-year time frame to fill up the GERD's reservoir, much to the disagreement of Egypt. The two biggest points of divergence between them currently is on what happens if there is a drought during the filling process, and what happens during a disagreement between them. Egypt and Sudan have frequently sought out a third party to mediate talks between them and Ethiopia on the GERD, such as the United Nations, the United States, the European Union, and recently the African Union, all of which Ethiopia has rejected to consider. After the dam finished construction in 2020, Ethiopia unilaterally decided to begin its first filling of the reservoir during the rainy monsoon season in July, when water flow through the Blue Nile was the highest. In retaliation for what it perceived as a unilateral action without negotiating with Egypt, the United States decided to cut $100 million worth of foreign aid to Ethiopia in the aftermath. 1 year later, in July of 2021, Ethiopia went ahead with another unilateral second filling of the dam's reservoir during the monsoon season. And then a few months later, both Sudan and Egypt referred the situation to the United Nations Security Council for assistance for the first time. And then in July of 2022, Ethiopia unilaterally went ahead with its third and largest filling of the reservoir to date. It is lucky that 2019 and 2020 were both unusually wetter and rainier years for Egypt than normal, which helped to mitigate the effects of Ethiopia's initial fillings. But Ethiopia is not planning to have finished filling up the reservoir until around 2027, and with no ability to negotiate or financially influence their way out of it, Egypt will really only be left with two available options if this day ever comes. Sit back and do nothing and see whatever happens to Egypt's instability, or lash out against Ethiopia and the GERD with a military attack. The Egyptian High Command could theoretically authorize fighter jets, bombers, and/or cruise missiles on a raiding mission to fly across the country and through Sudan's airspace, who would likely be friendly to such an operation, and then strike the GERD, which is only 40 kilometers beyond the Sudanese border. The Ethiopians continue to largely rely on outdated Soviet-era fighters like the MiG-23 and Su-27, and they don't have very many of them in comparison to the Egyptian Air Force. A successful strike would destroy the dam and free up the waters to flow back up to Egypt into Lake Nasser behind their Aswan High Dam. But obviously, this action would be interpreted as a major act of war in Ethiopia, and the Egyptians could expect massive retaliation coming from Addis Ababa and her allies. A $5 billion dam would be destroyed, along with more than a decade's worth of work on Ethiopia's part, and their bright future of bringing electricity access to half of their country would be lying in ruins. And internationally, an Egyptian bombing campaign carried out on Ethiopian soil would be almost inevitably interpreted as a major act of aggression, and Egypt would stand to be cast as a warmongering pariah state. While the strike may alleviate Egypt's drought in the immediate sense, Egypt's long-term prospects at continuing to function would probably end up looking a lot worse. But a country who's pressed into a corner by something perceived as an existential threat is a country that is more willing to gamble and take massive risks in order to get out of that corner. Ethiopia has been setting a precedent for damming the Nile without any negotiations with any of its neighbors. In the future, Ethiopia may take further unilateral actions by building even more dams along the Blue Nile without consulting any of her neighbors. The GERD is specifically a hydroelectric dam without any planned uses for irrigation, meaning that after the dam's reservoir is finished being filled, Ethiopia will supposedly not restrict any more water heading further downstream towards Egypt. But hypothetical future dams built with irrigation in mind will continue withdrawing water from the river to feed Ethiopian farms even after their reservoirs are filled. For decades, Ethiopia and Sudan have both clashed over the ownership of the Al-Fashqa Triangle, a fertile agricultural area nearby to the GERD and its reservoir. Back in 2008, both sides had come to an agreement where Ethiopian farmers would till and work the land here, while Sudan would retain administrative authority over it. But that deal all came crashing down at the end of 2020, when the biggest war of the 21st century exploded within Ethiopia as the Tigray region rebelled against the central Ethiopian government in Addis Ababa. Sudan decided to forcibly expel the Ethiopian farmers from the Al-Fashqa Triangle and consolidate its control as Ethiopia descended further into civil war and chaos, and so lacked any viable method to retaliate. The central government began accusing the Egyptians of covertly funneling weapons, ammunition, and supplies to the rebel forces in the Tigray region and other armed groups opposed to the Ethiopian government. The Tigray War, lasting between 2020 and 2022, ultimately became a sort of proxy war, wherein the Egyptian government allegedly supplied the rebels to remove the Ethiopian government from power and hopefully install a new government in its place, who would be more willing to enter into negotiations with Cairo over the GERD, its reservoir, and the future of the Nile. Totalitarian Eritrea's modern-day slave army invaded the Tigray region at the request of the Ethiopian government, while the Tigray rebel forces themselves came close to beating them all back and capturing the Ethiopian capital itself in Addis Ababa. Hundreds of thousands of troops on all sides were mobilized to fight against each other, and by the conflict's conclusion, after 2 years of near total genocidal war, an estimated 600,000 people lay dead, marking it as the deadliest human conflict that began in the 21st century.